I'm reading today from The New God Image by Edward Edinger from the appendices, and today I'm reading from a letter to the Reverend David Cox dated November 12th, 1957. Page 192. The trouble I have with my academic reader is that he cannot see a psychic structure as a relatively autonomous entity, because he is under the illusion that he is dealing with a concept. But in reality, it is a living thing. The archetypes all have a life of their own, which follows a biological pattern. Reading on page 192. A passionate discourse between the man Job and God will logically lead to a mutual rapprochement. God will be humanized. Man will be divinized. Thus Job will be followed by the idea of the incarnation of God and the redemption and apotheosis of man. The arch sin of the Catholic Church is sexuality and the ideal par excellence of virginity, which puts a definite stop to life. But if life should insist on going on, the shadow steps in and sin becomes a serious problem, because the shadow cannot be left to eternal damnation anymore. Consequently, at the end of the first millennium of the Christian eon, as predicted in the Apocalypse, the world was suspected of being created by the devil. The impressive and still living myth of the Holy Grail came to life with its two significant figures of Parsifal and Merlin. Continuing on page 193, a psychological reading of the dominant archetypal images reveals a continuous series of psychological transformations depicting the autonomous life of archetypes behind the scenes of consciousness. This hypothesis has been worked out to clarify and make comprehensible our religious history. The treatment of psychological troubles and the inability of my patients to understand theological interpretations and terminology have given me my motive. The necessities of psychotherapy have proved to me the immense importance of a religious attitude, which cannot be achieved without a thorough understanding of religious tradition, just as an individual's troubles cannot be understood and cured without a basic knowledge of their biographical antecedents. I have applied to the God image what I have learned from the reconstruction of so many human lives through a knowledge of their unconscious. All of this is empirical and may have nothing to do with theology if theology says so, but if theology should come to the conclusion that its tenets have something to do with the empirical human psyche, I establish a claim. I think that in those circumstances my opinion should be given a hearing. It cannot be argued on the level of metaphysical assertions. It can be criticized only on its own psychological level, regardless of whether it is a psychologically satisfactory interpretation of the facts or not. The facts are the documented historical manifestations of the archetype, however erroneous they may be. And continuing on page 194, my approach is certainly not theological. It is essentially a psychological attempt based upon the archetypal, amoral God image, which is not a concept but rather an irrational and phenomenal experience. But insofar as theologians are also concerned with the adult human psyche, perhaps not as much as medical psychology, I am convinced that it would be of advantage to them to become acquainted with the psychological aspects of the Christian religion. I will not conceal the fact that theological thinking is very difficult for me, from which I conclude that psychological thinking must be an equally laborious undertaking for the theologian. When I see how China and soon India will lose her culture under the impact of materialistic rationalism, I grow afraid that the Christian West will succumb to the same malady. Simply because the old symbolic language is no longer understood, and people cannot see anymore where and how it applies. In Catholic countries, anyone leaving the church becomes frankly atheistic. In Protestant countries, a small number become sectarians, and the others avoid the churches for their cruelly boring and empty sermons. Not a few begin to believe in the state, not even knowing that they themselves are the state. What an understanding, all due to the lack of psychological standpoint, or so it seems to me.